I'm always so pleased when people are still here after the intermission. Well, thank you for your questions. A lot came in at the end, and it's rather interesting how a number of you were thinking along the same lines. But first, just an informational question, because clearly some of these definitions and discussions are confusing to people. So I'll throw this to Anne and anyone else who wants to talk about it. Would you mind comparing and contrasting the various gender identities, such as the example between transgender and cisgender? I think people want to know. They aren't familiar with those terms. And
okay, well, happy to do that. So in my mind, with my molecular biology background, the term cis means two aspects of a gene that are on the same chromosomal strand, the same DNA strand, and whereas and the term trans means you have one trait on one DNA strand and the analogous trait on the opposite strand or pair. So for me, that's what's in the back of my head. But what is important to understand is that sex itself is not a unitary thing in biology. There are many levels of biological sex, starting with the chromosomes, but then from the chromosomes you develop a fetal gonad. The fetal gonads produce, depending on whether it's a fetal ovary or a fetal testis, produce different kinds of hormones. Those hormones in turn influence internal fetal development in either a female direction, so that ovaries and a uterus and a fallopian tube begin to develop, or in a male direction, the ducts, especially the epididymis that connects to the testis, begin to develop. In turn, those influence the development of external genitalia, which look very similar in a 6-month-old baby, but begin to differentiate into either a penis or a vagina. So the fused lips of the outer vagina actually form the scrotum, for example. It's the same physical structure. And then you go on through birth. You have the external response to external genitalia, and through adolescence, the production of adolescent hormones as being either masculinizing or feminizing cocktail of hormones. So when all of those levels of sex are the same, that is, they all signal either male or female, they're called cis because they're all giving the same message. But when some of them are different, they often result in something called intersex, but they're giving different messages across multiple levels. So at some levels, there's a biological message that's male, and at other levels, a biological level that's female. So the probably oversimplified account of cis and transgender is that you have someone whose identity, as it forms, is in agreement with all of the visible and below the surface biological components of sex. So someone is cisgender if they develop a female gender identity and have ovaries and also all of the external genitalia that go with being female. Someone is transgender if they develop a female gender identity, but they have a testes, a penis, scrotum, all of the hormonal cocktails that are seen as developing or signifying male, or the other way around. They could be transgender if they have a male gender identity, but all of the biological components that are normally associated with female development. So you have a disconnect between the physical or anatomical signs of gender and the mental or self-identity of being male or female. So if everything's in agreement, it's cis. if in this case, identity itself, sense of self, is not in agreement with the physical body, it's trans.
Great, thank you.
And another way to think of that is if you're comfortable with who you are, you're cis. If you're going out of your gourd, you're trans.
I don't know. That means on many days I'm trans, I think.
Welcome to you know what I mean. I'm talking about with respect to your gender.
Yeah, I know. I see. Well, speaking of that, I'll throw this in. This came from Twitter. It's point. What are the best arguments that being trans is not a mental illness? I am trans, and would like to say a huge thank you to you all. So how can we reach out to that person? What are the best arguments that it's not a mental illness?
Best of luck to you. I'm so glad you were born and living in this time instead of 40 years ago when I transitioned. Please don't go back in a closet. Please don't go from one closet to another. Please don't go from one closet to another.
But in terms of arguing, in terms of mental illness, or what is a mental illness?
Well, it's not a mental illness.
Yeah,
It's one more variation in the wonderful creation that God has given us, or nature has given us, however you're comfortable with that.
You know which way I'm coming from.
I said this to Lawrence earlier today, that nature includes the Venus flytrap, the blue potato, and the lobster. I think were those the three.
Yeah.
Surely, if there's room in God's creation for that, there's certainly room in the world for us and for all of you to be yourselves.
Okay. That's a great way of
And
You're not mentally ill.
no one should be forced to take part in a conversation in which their own humanity, by which we mean are you crazy or not, is a matter of kind of interesting intellectual discussion. You know, that's not dignified. You know, do we seem crazy?
I'm not crazy.
Okay, so we clear that up.
So I also think it's important to point out that the notion of mental illness itself, there's no absolute definition of mental illness. It's something created by a group of psychologists and psychiatrists in a great big book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is designed simply to be able to gain, to receive health insurance for people who are in need of treatment.
Yes.
So, so there is no such thing as an abstract mental illness. It's all what we culturally define as being mental illness or not. Homosexuality was defined as a mental illness 60 years ago, but it's not anymore.
Well, the Vatican would still define it that way, actually, and still does. I just want to add that the clear evidence that trans people, this is clear evidence that trans people are mentally ill, but the point is that you're a woman, and only a mentally ill person could not see that, it seems to me.
Yes, but you know the definition of hysteria, right? Comes, I mean, you know, it comes from having a womb. So it's all, you know, but we were talking last night about the value of difference, the value of growing up or being in a situation where you have the experience of being different and the things that you learn from that. And one of the things that I learned from it along the way is to understand when the problem wasn't me, the problem was the other people.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you kind of got to get your head into that space. The problem's not you, the problem's with the other people.
Yeah, the writer William Gibson has a wonderful quote, which I'll clean up for this venue.
No, don't.
Something like, if you are depressed and feeling low, before you do anything drastic, take a moment just to consider the possibility that your real problem is that you are just surrounded by assholes.
That's right.
Sorry.
No, I think I will add to that something because I just attended an event about, and it's a big issue about conformity and free speech on campuses, that if we try and make campuses places where everyone has the same views and no one is uncomfortable, then you won't learn who is an asshole. And I think it's a really important lesson to learn. Now, in any case, let's move on. Let me ask Kaipo this because it relates to something you talked about at lunchtime that I think is a really fascinating question. I'd like the rest of the audience to hear about it. It says, what can be done to provide couples who don't believe in marriage with the same privileges as married couples, law-wise?
Well, thanks for the question.
I think the person who asked it just clapped.
Thank you. So the reality is that there might be judicial solutions and there are legislative solutions and they're just solutions that individuals are creating for themselves by trying to kind of create arrangements between themselves. So people are free to try to live their lives the way they want to and even to try to make enforceable agreements between themselves that can create certain rights and obligations between themselves. But ultimately, many benefits that we see associated with marriage originate in the state, and so it's the state's prerogative to provide them to people or not. And so access to marriage for same-sex couples is an important step because it allows them to access a pre-made package of legal rights and obligations that many people enjoy. We haven't seen courts too sympathetic to the idea that the law requires states to create something other than marriage that nonetheless is a collection of benefits. So there are some states that have provided those for its citizens, like Colorado's a really good example, but it's just because the legislators in those states have decided that there are more than one type of intimate adult relationship that's worth protecting. And unfortunately, for people in states that don't have legislators that share those views, there's only so much you can do. So I do think there's a growing movement of scholars who are trying to think about ways in which we can argue that the Constitution compels states to recognize or give certain benefits to non-marital relationships, but we're kind of far from being there yet, and really it's about trying to strike down interference as opposed to actually affirmatively create that, unless you have really enlightened legislators.
Well, let me add to that, because you made a point today which really fascinated me and surprised me, that in some sense the same-sex marriage legislation, by the virtue of the language in which it was enacted by the Supreme Court, in fact penalizes especially same-sex couples that don't decide to marry.
Well, and all couples that don't decide to marry, so that from time to time, really close heterosexual couple, one of them might be killed in a tragic accident, and they live like a married couple, but they're not married. A court would be very unsympathetic to a lawsuit for wrongful death by the surviving partner because that person, the couple, simply didn't avail themselves of the choice to marry. For a while, courts were somewhat sympathetic to claims by same-sex couples because they couldn't marry. Now that marriage is an option, I think we're going to see a lot more of courts just refusing to recognize the relationship that wasn't formalized, where the state wasn't invited in, basically, as a partner to the marriage.
It's certainly a fascinating, it's a sad but fascinating example of unintended consequences, I think, that we really have to be aware of.
Right.
Another legal question, which Kaipo or Phyllis might want to talk to, or maybe anyone I'll throw it out to, is how can we move forward with a public policy at the state level in Arizona, but I think one could argue it at any state level. What kind of public policy options can we do to make public policy more rational at the state level?
Vote.
I think that's what I was trying to say in one word, basically.
Really. I mean, I come from Texas. We were talking about assholes earlier. Our legislature, oh my God, it is awful. And if people, I don't understand why people continue to vote against their own best interest, but they do. You've got to vote, you've got to go to your state capitol, you've got to lobby, you've got to get involved. Otherwise, you get what these crazy people give you. And marriage is, whether it's same-sex or opposite-sex marriage, if you remove all the love and everything else from it, it's basically contract law. It's just that the state has adopted a package of contract law that goes with the marriage ceremony that says how property will be divided upon death if you don't leave a will. And if someone needs to sue some of the partners, like you just said, under wrongful death, or in the matter of children, or in the matter of divorce, there's a huge package of contract law. If you don't want to get married, that's fine. Hire a lawyer and draw up contracts to govern how your business relationships, how your bank accounts, how your powers of attorney, how your wills, and all that other stuff are going to be taken care of when something goes wrong.
I agree, except if you don't marry, you'll never get your partner covered. Your partner won't be a surviving spouse for the purpose of getting Social Security benefits.
Absolutely.
So there's certain things that are just withheld from you unless you marry.
The question of how to create a better Arizona is not only a legal one, it's also a social one. And if we're talking specifically about LGBT people, if you're part of our community, come out and be known. If you're not, if you're an ally, or if you're a friend, or if you're a family member, when you hear somebody at ASU say something mean about transgender people or gay people, don't be silent. Speak up. Say, that's not cool.
That's right. Absolutely.
If there's somebody that you know who's different, be a friend to them. We change the world by being visible, and so if you're afraid, I sympathize, because I know what it's like to be afraid of what other people are going to say. But in my own case, when I came out, found mostly love from other people, including from some of the people whom I most expected to lose, including my greatest ally, my 85-year-old conservative Christian mother, whom, when I came out to her, took me in her arms and quoted 1 Corinthians to me and said, "Love will prevail." She said, "I would never abandon my child." And if you are afraid, you're not wrong to be afraid, but be wise about the risks and the dangers there are in this world, but don't shut yourself off from the possibility that you may well receive love where you least expect it. So as long as gay people or trans people or anybody who's different is over there, as long as they're the others that we can safely make fun of, that's one kind of Arizona. But if it's a community in which everyone feels respected and safe, and that it's okay to be different, and people who are in the majority can stick up for those people, that's how you create a better world.
Thank you. I want to continue with the question a little bit to talk about public policy, because I do want to. You jumped over something you said about Houston, but I don't know, but I would be surprised if Arizona wasn't one of the states that's instituting bathroom laws, given our legislature. And I think one of the suggestions you made, which may have gone too quickly, but I know you made it, is that there can be a law that would satisfy the intent, or at least the claimed intent of those people, but in fact would protect transgender people. So maybe you could talk about it again, just a little, emphasize it one more time, the wording. Okay.
Houston has an ordinance 28-20, and you can Google it up. And it says, it's entitled something like entering restrooms of the opposite sex. And it says, you know, essentially, thou shalt not enter a restroom, public restroom of the sex designated opposite, blah, 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 blah. And it is what all these people that are all worried and got their underwear in a wad, it takes care of that. But then it's got two defenses. And the first one is, unless you are the owner or the manager or the lessee or the tenant of that particular piece of property. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that if a male janitor goes into the women's restroom to clean it, he's not going to be arrested. If a woman janitor goes in the men's restroom to clean it, she's not going to be arrested. How many of y'all, especially the women, have gone to women's conventions and hotels, and rather than have a line that goes forever at the women's restroom, the hotel puts a sign on the men's restroom that says, you know, women's restroom. And so even though you have to walk by a bunch of urinals, there's a whole bunch more stalls to use. Well, that's the owner of the building. Any owner, manager, lessee, if your boss, if you have less than 15 employees and you're trans and your boss says, I don't care which restroom you use, and they're renting that property, then it's a defense, and nobody's breaking the law. And then there's the second defense, and that is with the designed intent to cause a disturbance. Transgender people don't go to the restroom to cause a disturbance. We go to the restroom to go to the restroom, and that's the only reason. But there are people who are worried about in the schools, some teenage boy swiping his mother's wig and padded bra and skirt, putting it in his backpack, going to school, and then with his friends, they're all giggly and everything else, and he puts it on, and he goes in the girls' restroom and says, you know, I'm transgender today. And then he exposes himself, or he masturbates, or he takes out his cell phone so that he can stand on the toilet and take pictures of the girls in the next stall going to the bathroom or whatever. Well, I think that in Arizona, I know in Texas, and I feel pretty sure in every state in the union, that if you Google your state's criminal law, your penal code, you will find that indecent exposure is a jailable offense. Public lewdness is a jailable offense. Taking video cameras into restrooms and doing indecent photographs are offenses. If they're involved with children under 14, they become felonies. And if you're worried about some man, because there's now, you know, transgenders can use the restrooms with their gender identity, some man saying, I'm transgendered, going into the women's restroom, trapping their daughter in a stall, well, that's entrapment, which involves a child as a felony. If there's rape or any other type of thing, that's a felony. All these things are already against the law. So, you know, what are they worried about? Well, they're worried about the fact that they can't deal with who we are, and so they've just got this thing. So give them a law, give them a policy. It's against the law to use the restroom of the opposite sex as long as you don't do it to cause a disturbance. In early 1990s, the Houston Vice Squad was busy arresting transgender people that didn't pass very well, that were using the women's restroom because these were transgender women. And a lot of them came to me as lawyer Phyllis, Frye, great savior of the world, and they wanted to hire me, and the maximum fine then was $400. And they wanted me to do a jury trial. Well, I'm not going to do a jury trial for under a couple of grand. And nobody was going to spend a couple of grand for a $400 maximum fine. So I told them this. when you're supposed to go to court, go to court. Go as your transgendered woman's self. Respectfully ask the judge for a jury trial date. When your jury trial date comes up, go as your transgendered woman's self. Let the police officer say what he or she's going to say. Let the DA, a prosecutor, let them do all their stuff. And then it comes your turn, and you're sworn in, and you stand up and say, yes, I used the women's restroom. The statute says I'm not supposed to if I'm going to cause a disturbance. I went into the restroom. I walked straight to the stall. I went in the stall. I locked the stall. I went to the bathroom. I unlocked the stall. I left. I didn't stop to primp. I didn't stop to wash my hands. I left. I did not go in to cause a disturbance. After about 5 or 6 not guilty jury verdicts, the prosecutors told the vice squad, quit arresting these people.
Excellent. So the point is that one can put... But I also want to ask Gloria, although I'm going to get to you in another question as well, but I mean, this isn't just a transgender question. This is about public policy in general. Are there public policies related to other issues in Arizona that you're familiar with that might improve the state?
Oh, that might have something to do with something. You know, I'm not totally up on all of the latest, but it seems that there's a constant flood of attempts to make it impossible to provide birth control and family planning services, to provide abortion services, to provide medical abortion through telemedicine. There's a constant flood of it. And you know, my belief about that is that doesn't change until 2 things happen. One is what everybody here has been talking about, and that is getting involved, not just voting. It starts way before voting. You have to get involved. You have to be part of a movement. You have to make your voices heard, write letters to the editor. You have to use the political power that each and every person here has, but we don't always know it. We don't always use it. We have to play hardball and say, be public about withholding our support from people whose policies would be hurtful to us and to the things that we believe are for truth and justice and the American way. But that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, I think, is always having a proactive agenda. Don't wait and dance to the tune of the people who are attacking you. Have legislation, put legislation out there that they have to answer to. And it gives you the opportunity it gives you a platform, it gives you the opportunity to create the controversy, it gives you an opportunity to explain to people, to explain to the public why your beliefs are what they are. And one thing we know about Arizona, by the way, is that when there have been ballot initiatives and the people of the state have had to actually pay attention to reproductive rights issues, to gay rights issues, on almost every occasion, they have voted against bigotry, they have voted in favor of reproductive rights, they have voted in favor of gay rights, or at least against ballot initiatives that would restrict any of those. So when you can get the attention of the people and you can educate them, you can usually get the policies that you want.
Excellent. Okay, that's great. I'll also say, by the way, in regard to to extend this further to the fear of being different, that one other way we can improve public policy at the state level in Arizona is people who happen to look like they're Mexican shouldn't be afraid to walk on the streets of Phoenix.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, so a few more questions. There were a lot of questions there were a lot of advice questions, and I'm hesitant to do it, but here's one that maybe you can hit a little bit. I am a new grandmother to a baby girl. What's the best advice I can give her? How can I best support her aspirations and encourage her best self? Anyone want to just quick answer to that?
Oh, just do that. That is so sweet. I mean, that is exactly, just to have that attitude and to offer that support and to be there and to let's do the symbol. Yeah, let the child flower, right?
There was a related question to that too, which is sort of how should I impose a gender actually, it's an interesting question. It was in the original pile that, should I, as a parent, impose a gender on my child or not? And the question is, how can you not? So I don't know if people want to address that at all.
Well, that's fine. You've got a child and you think it's a girl, or you got a child and you think it's a boy, and it probably is. That's fine. But when they start showing signs that they don't like the colors that they're being assigned, or they aren't comfortable with the toys that they're getting to play with, or they want to play with the other girls instead of the other boys, or vice versa, be sensitive to that. I'm a grandmother. I watched my first grandchild grow, and when I could tell by the time that she was 3 that she was happy being a girl, that she loved all kinds of girl things, and she was comfortable in her skin, and everything was fine on that. But a lot of parents, I take transgender children through the courts. I've taken 2 as young as 6. And at first, some of the judges were very resistant. They said, how do we know this is going to work? And I said, well, we don't. But wouldn't you rather, have the gender and the name changed as the kid is beginning to go through school so that the kid can find out if this works, rather than have the kid go through hell and possibly end up having some kind of surgery that's irreversible? Because if this doesn't work, I'll have the child back in front of you in 2 or 3 years and we'll change it back. So, let the kid explore.
Find out what you're
Lawrence, I'd like to add something to that, and that is that children ingest from the culture no matter what we do. I mean, children learn from the people around them. It's not just ourselves. My daughter didn't let her children watch television, her 2 boys watch television. She was so determined that she was going to raise them as, they were going to be able to be whatever they were, and they were going to be, neutral. She wasn't going to impose male patterns on them. By the time they were 2 years old, they had never been given a gun. They were, their fingers became guns.
That's right.
Because your children will gather in information from the culture. So I would say to parents, you can't be neutral. You have to be willing to talk about those things and explain them to children. And while you are giving your children the opportunity to develop as to whoever they are, if you're not addressing those issues, then you don't know what you're going to get. So,
that's
right. The culture is it's oppressive and impressive.
And we're saying the same thing, because I showed you the picture of me when I was 5 and I was holding my dog, and I already knew something was different. I had a girl cousin that was my age. I wanted to play with her toys. I wanted to play with her dolls. And my parents, they weren't mean to me, but they were trying to do the best they could, and they would say, no, little boys don't play with that. Here, cap gun. Here, this. Here, that. No, you can't do this. And you get these cues from the grandparents and everybody else. So what did I do? Well, I wanted to be loved. So I gave them what they wanted, and I hid who I was. But it didn't change anything. So go ahead and be a grandma, love your grandchild, whoever she is, whoever he is. Believe me, if they're not cisgendered, they'll let you know.
I hope so. Yeah. This is I guess this is to Gloria and also Kaipo perhaps. Can you speak to the Hyde Amendment and its impact on the ability to connect accurate data on abortion? So, yeah. Do you want to?
Can I tell a story about my first encounter with Mr. Hyde?
Yeah, sure.
It was fun.
Not too long ago.
Dr. Jekyll then?
It was a lot of fun, actually. It was my first congressional testimony, and the deck had been set up so that all of the people who were there representing the reproductive health and rights organizations would look really, really bad. And so when I began to speak, Mr. Hyde started in on me, and the legislation was the federal abortion ban legislation. And instead of addressing the legislation to me, Representative Hyde said, Mrs. Felt, of course it was Mrs. Felt, right? Mrs. Felt, aren't you concerned about the number of abortions? And I pulled out my note card and I said, Mr. Hyde, I have been reviewing your voting record, and I noticed that you have never once voted for family planning. And so if you are so concerned about the numbers of abortions, why have you never once voted for family planning? The place erupted in cheers, even though nobody was supposed to do that in a congressional hearing room. And Mr. Hyde went, blub, 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 blub. And my staff gave me a T-shirt that said, Felt 1, Hyde 0.
That's great.
So I would say, I mean, actually, in all seriousness, the Hyde Amendment, the Helms Amendment before it, which restricted funding for abortion for international family planning, and then the Hyde Amendment did the same thing for domestic family planning, are much more insidious than they would appear to be on the surface. On the surface, it appears to be a simple issue of what gets funded and what doesn't get funded. But actually, it started the slippery slope toward an increasing number of restrictions on women's ability to get a whole range of reproductive health care services. And so the moment is right now to turn that completely around.
Yes, it is.
Okay, 2 more questions. There were a bunch of questions on this subject, and they were addressed to me, which surprised me, or a few of them anyways. But anyway, is there a running hypothesis on an evolutionary advantage or disadvantage to transgender phenomena for one person, or do you feel that gender identity has an evolutionary aspect? And so we haven't touched on it. I mean, since it was addressed to me, I'll start, although, I'll start. And the answer is yes. And the answer is yes, because you can't understand biology except in the context of evolution. And there are many arguments that evolutionary biologists have made, for example, for the utility of homosexuality in a small tribe, for example. And so we may not always understand, as it took a while to understand, for people to come up with the evolutionary advantage of altruism. Evolution is at the heart of basically who we are, even if it involves sometimes maladaptations. But maybe Anne might want to add some expert opinion in that regard.
Well, I think it's wrong to think about evolution in such a strict adaptationist, specific selectional way. So I think the formulation of the question is, like I started out with, nature versus nurture is the wrong way to look at it. I think that question is imperfectly formulated. And the reason is that it's probably looking incorrectly at how selection works, at what the level of selection is. So from my point of view, what's important about natural selection and how it works in concert with development within a generation, within a single generation, is that what we're interested in is biological plasticity and variability. That often provides the raw material for future evolution. It provides a way for a species to survive if they're highly variable in very different kinds of environmental situations, for us possibly underwater before too long, at least for those of us who live on the coast. So the question is how did, first of all, 2 sexes evolve in the first place, but more importantly, what maintains biological variability? Why is biological variability itself important? And if you ask that question, you have the whole question of different gender identities and how they are maintained as part of a diverse population. So I think it's rather than assuming that some utilitarian account that everything that exists was selected for a reason.
Yeah, I guess that's a much clearer way of saying, but I guess the point is that sex itself, in some sense, sexual reproduction instead of asexual reproduction, allows for greater variation, which allows for ultimately, at least if you look at the history of the Earth, I think it seems to allow.
You know, one of my favorite biologists in the world, Lynn Margulis, who was well noted for having discovered that symbiosis was at the basis of cellular evolution, also argues that that sex was not selected for, and I think she made a compelling, although incomplete, argument, and unfortunately she died so prematurely that she didn't get to develop it further, but that it's not so much that sexual reproduction evolved because it promoted greater variability, but rather it was a way of specializing once multicellularity evolved. So you have sexual reproduction that exists alongside and in the same organisms as asexual reproduction in single-sex organisms. But what became crucial was when you developed in single-celled organisms. When you developed from multi-cell organisms began to evolve, then how they accomplished reproduction and a whole lot of other things required that the different cells in the single body specialized. And it was at that moment that's the kind of sexual reproduction we understand evolved, and it was a response to multicellularity, not a response to generating diversity.
Lawrence, can I take as the humanist on the panel, can I take a crack at a scientific answer?
Absolutely.
Sure. I did.
I used to ask myself, why did God make me like this? Like, is this, people will often say to me, well, God doesn't make mistakes. To which I will respond, that's correct, and I am no mistake. Because I say that now, but I used to think, well, if I've been if God's challenge to me is that I'm giving you this soul and this body, and they don't match, and that's your challenge. I used to wrestle with this and think, really? You want me to become a woman? Like, I was thinking maybe president instead, or maybe a millionaire. But you want woman? That's the goal here. So, I think that my answer is for two reasons. I'm here, for one thing, to see. I was given this challenge to see whether or not I had the courage to become myself. So to a certain degree, and again, this is a challenge that we all have, whether you're trans or not. We all are given a dragon to slay in our lives. So this was mine. And so the challenge was, do you have the courage to become yourself? And the other part of it was that we present a challenge to other people who may not understand the whole transgender thing at all. And the question is, can you show love to people you do not understand, people whose experience of the world is unlike your own? How loving can you be? And so that's why it's an evolutionary answer, because it is good for the species to have courage and to be loving.
Great. Okay. I think it's good for us to be that way. Although some people, well, anyway, yeah. But I do want to. I don't want to. No, I don't want to. I gave an answer that made it sound like I accepted the idea of group selection, which is what you were talking about. And I think the point is that there are advantages to nearby kin to your genes. So evolution takes place at the genetic level, but I agree that I think on the whole, as intelligent species, which some of us are, that love seems to be a good idea. And in that regard,
okay.
I want to end with the last question, which is, what can we do as members of our community to make it better for any who might face discrimination to come out or transition or to be empowered? I'd generalize that. Any last remarks on what we can do just to make it easier for people who are having a hard time to live an easier life.
Well, it's a variation on what Jenny said earlier. If you want to be helpful, you've got to live a life that lets people know that you're accepting. You've got, as a supportive, straight ally, you got to come out of the closet. You got to let people know that you are supportive of anybody that is gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans. You've got to let people know that you're not a racist. You've got to be vocal about it. You've got to wear a sign that says, I'm not a bigot. You know, this is a safe place. At my alma mater at Texas A&M, we have what we call allies. And these are teachers and graduate assistants and office staff people that work throughout the campus, and they have a little decal that is known that says ally, and they put it on their office door, they put it on their cubicle, and it's a little silent thing that lets anybody know that wants to come out, that wants a friend, that is tired of being afraid, that knows that that's a safe place that they can go to. And so all of you out there, if you're straight and loving and accepting, you got to come out of the closet and let people know that.
Here, here.
Gloria?
Yeah, just to support that, a mentor of mine told me, and it has become one of my personal mantras, the fastest route to self-esteem is to stand up for what you believe. So if you stand up for what you believe, you're not just doing good for somebody else, you're actually helping yourself too. You're being authentic. You're being real, and you're strengthened as well. So the fastest route to self-esteem is to stand up for what you believe. Try it, you'll like it.
Nice.
Yeah, I'll buy that. I think you expressed with your concepts a bunch of times that to be more loving as a society is a way to help people feel courage. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
I only say that I was thinking earlier, was saying the question of what's the difference between transgender and cisgender. The question of what is transgender is a complicated one for many people who don't live our lives. And transgender is an umbrella term. It includes lots of different ways of being gender different. And you know, someone who gives a lecture on Transgender 101 is going to tell you the difference between a transsexual and a cross-dresser and a genderqueer person and a drag queen, and you know, and you know, all the different ways there are of being this vague thing, trans. So some other lecture, some other evening, somebody can do that. But it's maybe not necessary for you to know all of that right now. The only thing, maybe all that's necessary is to know that the world changes when we open our hearts. And so let's all do that. Let's open our hearts.
And just saying. Okay. If you want something to do, get hold of the, have you ever seen this blue square on the backs of some cars and it has a yellow equal sign?
Mm-hmm. The Human Rights Campaign.
That's from the Human Rights Campaign. It stands for equal. All right, you're a straight person. You want to identify yourself as someone who's open. Put one of those on your car.
And you can also check out GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, which is another fine LGBT civil rights advocacy organization. I
encourage all of you to in fact, follow up. And one of the things that I was going to say, there are a bunch of things I want to say, is that we are now in the process at Origins of trying to increase the longevity and impact of all of our events, including our workshops, by building educational portals that include materials from everyone who has appeared on our events. We now have 2 this week, one from our workshop in the origins of violence, one on extinctions, and we'll be continuing to do that. So the materials of the incredible people we bring here will be accessible to all of you. So I encourage you to go to our website. The other thing I wanted to say, there's two other things I wanted to say to conclude. One was that, I'll answer that question a different way. I often, I'm a member of another oppressed minority, which is called atheists. And, but I don't want to play that up, but I was sort of translating every time I heard that word. And I know from some of the things we've done, in fact, a movie I made with some of the people who are filming this, that I get letters from people that say two things. One, that they really appreciate it because, first of all, they learned they weren't bad people just by watching. And two, that they learned that they weren't alone. And that's I think, how we can do this is by educating people, by having events like this and speaking about this. People realize that you can meet people, you can see people, and learn that they're not bad people, and learn that people who are different are not bad people. And that's the final thing I think I want to take away from this, is that we had this in this election year, as I began this event by saying, for a reason. If in this year you hear politicians trying to make you afraid of people who are different, you have to ask yourself, what are they trying to gain by making you afraid? And then I hope an event like this will make you realize that you have much more to gain by not being afraid. And so that's the message I hope we leave for you tonight. And I want to thank this amazing group of people and all of you for coming tonight. We will have, I believe, a book signing for those people on the stage that have books. I also want to tell you that the next Origins event will be October 19th in this theater, dialogue with Elizabeth Colbert, who won the Pulitzer Prize for her book, The Sixth Extinction, because our theme for the year in Origins is human challenges in the Anthropocene. This is one human challenge. Extinctions is another. And we'll have a variety of very exciting events in the spring that look at different aspects of the challenges that we humans have made as we've changed the face of our planet. So thank you again. Thank you again. Good night.
There are many levels of biological sex, starting with the chromosomes, but then from the chromosomes you develop a fetal gonad. The fetal gonads produce, depending on whether it's a fetal ovary or a fetal testis, produce different kinds of hormones. Those hormones in turn influence internal fetal development in either a female direction, so that ovaries and a uterus and a fallopian tube begin to develop, or in a male direction, the ducts, especially the epididymis that connects to the testis, begin to develop. In turn, those influence the development of external genitalia, which look very similar in a 6-month-old baby, but begin to differentiate into either a penis or a vagina. So the fused lips of the outer vagina actually form the scrotum, for example. It's the same physical structure. And then you go on through birth. You have the external response to external genitalia, and through adolescence, the production of adolescent hormones as being either masculinizing or feminizing cocktail of hormones. So when all of those levels of sex are the same, that is, they all signal either male or female, they're called cis because they're all giving the same message. But when some of them are different, they often result in something called intersex, but they're giving different messages across multiple levels. So At some levels, there's a biological message that's male, and at other levels, a biological level that's female. So the probably oversimplified account of cis and transgender is that you have someone whose identity, as it forms, is in agreement with all of the visible and below the surface biological components of sex. So someone is cisgender if they develop a female gender identity and have ovaries and also all of the external genitalia that go with being female. Someone is transgender if they develop a female gender identity, but they have a testes, a penis, scrotum, all of the hormonal cocktails that are seen as developing or signifying male, or the other way around. They could be transgender if they have a male gender identity, but all of the biological components that are normally associated with female development. So you have a disconnect between the physical or anatomical signs of gender and the mental or self-identity of being male or female. So if everything's in agreement, it's cis. If in this case, identity itself, sense of self, is not in agreement with the physical body, it's trans.
Great, thank you.
And another way to think of that is if you're comfortable with who you are, you're cis. If you're going out of your gourd, you're trans.
I mean, are you crazy or not, is a matter of kind of interesting intellectual discussion. You know, that's not dignified. You know, I mean, do we seem crazy?
I'm not crazy.
Okay, so we clear that up.
So I also think it's important to point out that the notion of mental illness itself, there's no absolute definition of mental illness. It's something created by a group of psychologists and psychiatrists and in a great big book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is designed simply to be able to gain, to receive health insurance for people who are in need of treatment.
Yes.
So, so there is no such thing as an abstract mental illness. It's all what we culturally define as being mental illness or not. Homosexuality was defined as a mental illness 60 years ago, but it's not anymore.
Well, the Vatican would still define it that way, actually, and still does. I just want to add that I mean, the clear evidence that trans people, this is clear evidence that trans people are mentally ill, but the point is that you're a woman, and only a mentally ill person could not see that, it seems to me.
Yes, but you know the definition of hysteria, right? Comes, I mean, you know, it comes from having a womb. So it's all, you know, but we were talking last night about the value of difference, the value of growing up or being in a situation where you have the experience of being different and the things that you learn from that. And one of the things that I learned from it along the way is to understand when the problem wasn't me, the problem was the other people.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you kind of got to get your head.
I don't know. That means on many days I'm trans, I think.
Welcome to you know what I mean. I'm talking about with respect to your gender.
Yeah, I know what I say. Well, speaking of that, I'll throw this in. This came from Twitter. It's point. What are the best arguments that being trans is not a mental illness? I am trans, and would like to say a huge thank you to you all. So how can we reach out to that person? What are the best arguments that it's not a mental illness?
Best of luck to you. I'm so glad you were born and living in this time instead of 40 years ago when I transitioned. Please don't go back in a closet. Please don't go from one closet to another. Please don't go from one closet to another.
But in terms of arguing, in terms of mental illness, or what is a mental illness?
Well, it's not a mental illness. It's one more variation in the wonderful creation that God has given us, or nature has given us, however you're comfortable with that.
You know which way I'm coming from.
I said this to Lawrence earlier today, that nature includes the Venus flytrap, the blue potato, and the lobster. I think were those the three.
Yeah.
Surely, if there's room in God's creation for that, there's certainly room in the world for us and for all of you to be yourselves.
Okay. That's a great way.
And
You're not mentally ill.
no one should be forced to take part in a conversation in which their own humanity, by which we
I'm always so pleased when people are still here after the intermission. Well, thank you for your questions. A lot came in at the end, and it's rather interesting how a number of you were thinking along the same lines. But first, just an informational question, because clearly some of these definitions and discussions are confusing to people. So I'll throw this to Anne and anyone else who wants to talk about it. Would you mind comparing and contrasting the various gender identities, such as the example between transgender and cisgender? I think people want to know. They aren't familiar with those terms. And
Okay, well, happy to do that. So in my mind, with my molecular biology background, the term cis means two aspects of a gene that are on the same chromosomal strand, the same DNA strand, and whereas and the term trans means you have one trait on one DNA strand and the analogous trait on the opposite strand or pair. So for me, that's what's in the back of my head. But what is important to understand is that sex itself is not a unitary thing in biology.